Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nuggets News. Well, I'm really excited today to be talking about the future of Ethereum with you guys. A lot of people are unaware that they're about to launch a new chain. There's a number of scaling solutions coming. We're going to talk about how this is going to affect you as a hodler. I've got my favorite ETH shirt on, guys. Let's get into it. Now, Ethereum have constantly had to update their roadmap. Shipping this code and doing this research has taken longer than first thought back in 2014. So the most recent updates, we're looking to implement Casper, the move to proof of stake in the next 12 to 24 months, and then sharding further down the line. And hopefully anyone with 32 ETH will be able to process transactions, and we'll talk about how that proof of stake is going to work going forward. Now, the big change is the launching of this new chain. So we've got this main chain, the proof of work chain that we're all familiar with, but the ETH team are launching a beacon chain, and then we're going to have shard chains and that virtual machine execution layer underneath. So we will dive into all this in more detail, but just be aware that there's some big changes coming. Now, this was a fantastic report done by Delphi Digital talking about the economics and the future of Ethereum, and I've picked out what I think are the most important slides to go over these topics with you guys today. Now, we have to remember that there's tens of billions of dollars at stake now in this ecosystem, and we saw so much money get raised by ICOs. And at the end of 2017, we see how much ETH was out there, and a lot of that did get sent to exchanges and sold. We had big outflows, and we've seen that ETH price have quite a substantial fall. On the positive side, we've seen big growth in decentralized finance. Maker has now locked up 2% of all Ethereum with their CPDs, but we also see, Uniswap, Augur, Compound, and DYDX. A lot of these other apps are starting to get really aggressive growth now, and it's an area that's very exciting as well as the STO space. If we have a look how Ethereum performed, it tends to have a high beta. Now, if you've traded stocks, you'll know what that means. But we're basically looking at the correlation. If Bitcoin moves, does Ethereum move more? And what we find is, yes, particularly to the downside, let's say Bitcoin drops 5%, we find that Ethereum tends to move 7 or 10%. It displays a higher beta correlation. And that has certainly been the case with the fall from the all-time highs. Ethereum has fallen 90% with Bitcoin falling around 70% throughout that time. If we have a look at ETH Sentiment, this is a really interesting chart. And what we see is when Ethereum tends to have this positive sentiment that came in April last year, we saw a big run up in price following it. Now, for the majority of the time since then, we've had pretty negative sentiment and the price has gone down. But really interestingly, we've seen sentiment pick up of late and prices remained relatively low. We've had a bit of a run up recently, but considering price is so far down, the ETH sentiment has really picked up lately, and we're going to see if this is going to lead to a pickup in price moving forward. When we have a look at how the traders have positioned themselves, we can see that a number of longs is again reaching near record levels, and then it's actually broken it recently since this report came out. So there's a record number of people with margin long positions betting the Ethereum price is going to go up. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be right. And in the past, that has actually led to some decreases in price. People can often be wrong. Now, when we look at the price versus the short positions inverse for the purpose of this chart, we see that that's been one of the main drivers. When we had huge amounts of shorting, people betting the price was going to go down, they really did drive that price lower. Now let's get into the Serenity economics when we're going to talk about proof of stake. And originally it was thought you might have to hold 1,500 ETH to become a proof of stake validator. Instead of with the miners doing all those transactions and packaging them into blocks, we now have the holders of Ethereum that validate the transactions and earn rewards. So hopefully by just holding 32 ETH, you'll be able to validate transactions and earn rewards. Now we also have sharding, so the network's going to get split into 1,024 shards is one of the proposals. I'll talk about how that's going to affect things more in the future. And we'll have this change to slot times and epics. If you've followed Cardano and the video I did recently on that, you'll know how this all works as well. So one of the things we have to consider is how much Ethereum is going to get locked up. As we just mentioned, there's 2 million ETH, or around 2% of all ETH, locked up in the Maker CPDs. So we know there's around 100 million ETH total. A lot of that is being used, and not all of it is going to be staked by people to verify transactions. So we have to get some projections on how much ETH is going to get locked up. And look, 10 million, about 10%, is a pretty common number that's used in these calculations. And that's going to get you a yield of around 2.5% rewards a year. And the issuance does depend on how much ETH is being staked, but a pretty low issuance rate at this stage. And inflation was one of the concerns in the early days. So this is a pretty low issuance rate compared to a lot of other projects out there. But when we look at this yield, it is really dependent on the network and the fees. So how many people are using this? Paying for transactions, depending on the total amount stake, those fees have to get dispersed between all those ETH holders that are staking and processing transactions. So as we can see, the more transactions, the higher the yield, the higher the reward is going to be if you're staking your Ethereum. But a lot of this is also dependent on the gas price. And gas is the price we pay to use the network's computational capacity. So if we have a lot of people needing a lot of capacity, paying a lot of fees in gas, then obviously these yields get a lot higher. Now, we also have to take into consideration the price of Ethereum and the total ETH stake. And one of the things to consider is as we break the network up into shards, gas will get cheaper because at the moment we have to have every node compute and store every transaction and so on. Now, when we break this up into shards, it makes it far more efficient. So we have the computation happening in these smaller shards. So you can get your transaction and computation done in a lot cheaper fashion once the network is sharded. The next thing to take into account here is the costs. So what is your net yield after you buy the hardware or set this up to be a network validator? Now, a lot of people are talking about doing this on the cloud and not outlaying hardware costs and so on. So these are things that we have to definitely consider. The next slide to look at is the Ethereum price. So obviously the higher ETH goes, the higher those rewards. And these are a couple of examples using 10% of ETH staked, 40% of ETH staked, and comparing whether we're going to set this up with cloud infrastructure or with actual hardware. So obviously the higher the ETH price goes, the better, the more attractive this becomes for network participants. But here we get into the concerns, and there's a bit of a feedback loop that gets created here. And having a secure network where validators process these transactions ensures the longevity of the network. But the problem with this report, what they found is they don't believe that the current rewards are attractive enough for people to stake unless there's really significant network fees. And there's not going to be significant network fees unless the network is secure. So this is kind of that feedback loop they're talking about. Security, more developers will build, attract more users, increase fees, increase the incentives for all us ETH holders to validate. And this positive feedback loop can also work in the other direction as well. So one of the things they're proposing is to change that base reward quotient. This is basically, you can think of this as how difficult it is to get those rewards when you're staking your Ethereum. Now, what they're proposing is at the start, have a low base reward quotient, which means it's a lot easier. There's going to be higher returns. It's more attractive at the start when we're implementing this technology. And then we double that, I guess you can think of it as difficulty every 5 years. And then we have less and less Ethereum being created over time for those people that are staking their ETH. As you can see here, this dramatically changes the yield and makes it far more attractive and less reliant on other things like gas price, network fees, and that sort of thing. We need people validating the transactions and supporting the network. Next up, I want to talk about this roadmap. So Ethereum was proposed by Vitalik, and back in 2014, we had that yellow paper. We then had the different releases. So Frontier, Homestead, Metropolis, and a lot of people got into the space in 2017. You'll be familiar with these hard forks, Byzantium and Constantinople. Next one is Istanbul towards the end of this year. But what a lot of people are unaware of is the Ethereum wants to make these big changes to Serenity and Proof of Stake. But in the meantime, we want to keep the Ethereum chain, that base chain, really highly functionable. So there's going to be a number of changes that are going to come to the Ethereum mainnet to ensure it remains usable up until we make this entire switch to proof of stake. So they're calling this Ethereum 1.x. Now, when we look at what they're trying to implement, they're going to launch that beacon chain, that new chain, and you'll be able to peg your Ethereum or lock it into that new chain if you do want to stake and get those rewards. But this is all still at least 12 months away. So that beacon chain is what that's going to be called. Then we have our shard chains, and I'll show you this graphic in just a second to get you a better idea of what this all looks like. So what are the scaling solutions? Well, there's a few being tossed around. You're probably familiar with a lot of these now from other projects, and proof of stake is the big change. As I said at the start, there's billions of dollars at stake here now, pardon the pun, but we have smaller projects experimenting with proof of stake. It has had its bugs. There's some that are implementing this very successfully. The network's running really well. Sharding is a very, very new technology with a number of projects researching it. ZK Snarks, you might be familiar with Zcash and that privacy feature. This is a dramatic scaling solution as well, which Vitalik has proposed. And then we have our layer 2 solutions that happen off the main chain, where we have Plasma, blockchains within blockchains, or you can think of it as side blockchains. Then we have our state channels, payment channels, our lightning networks, and the like. Here we see the changes that want to be made to that Ethereum 1.x main chain until we make that switch. And one of the concerns is that the size to run a full node depending on what client you're running. And I'll talk about the different clients at the end as well. So an archival node stores all the previous states as well as all the blocks. So you can see that's starting to get pretty big there, 2,000 gigabytes. So some changes they want to make: state rent, essentially charging a fee to store and maintain data on the blockchain. EWASM is a new virtual machine that improves efficiency. And then we've got pruning. So we want to try and cut down the size of the blockchain, particularly with old information that's not longer really relevant. And then we've got simulation and emulation as well. Now, here's the graphic that I was talking to about to get your head around this move from this main Ethereum chain proof of work to the beacon chain. And then we're going to have the chain broken up into these little shards, and then we have the execution layer, the virtual machine on top of. So we can have all our little DApps that are sitting on top of these application layers, on top of these little shards, rather than at the moment every transaction gets written by every node. The main blockchain, it can be quite slow. We've seen Ethereum, cap out at 15 transactions a second. Things like CryptoKitties really bloat the network. So next thing to talk about is Web 3.0, and this is probably summed up best by Brian Armstrong here, talking about the first iterations of the internet were really a way for anyone to sort of publish and distribute content. Then we then had Web 2.0, where we could interact with others and collaborate. But now Web 3.0 is all about value transfer and taking back control of your own data, distributing, decentralizing all this technology rather than the centralized silos and the web giants that we currently see extorting all our data. Now, Ethereum had always had this goal of building a world computer, and hopefully by now all these changes that I've spoken about, you can start to see how this is coming together, where we have that base state layer, then our computational layers, that virtual machine I just discussed, component layers, and then we have different protocol layers, things like 0x. We have our scalability, our lightning networks, user control layers, people starting to build on top of this now with our ledgers and Jax, MetaMask, and then our application layers, when you're starting to see all these dApps spring up now that are built on top of Ethereum using different protocols and scaling solutions. Another thing that's got really popular lately is this talk of STOs and just securitizing, digitizing all sorts of assets. So look, I am excited about the STO space, but I'm still more excited about the true utility in decentralized projects, decentralized finance. And I find that area far more fascinating than just turning all these different stocks, commodities, and assets into a digital form. Now we get to the technical risks, and one of the main ones is centralization. Are we too reliant on too few people in some areas of this ecosystem? Is it providing a central point of failure for something like MetaMask, where we have a lot of dApps now relying on that? The size of the blockchain was something that I touched on previously. Vulnerabilities in the code, and we see other projects taking different routes to try and ensure a higher standard of code. Cross-chain, cross-shard communication is something that is still very experimental. We have these little shards all computing. How are they going to talk to each other and remain in consensus? This research is still ongoing. On top of that, we've got a competitive landscape. So we've got all these other protocols that are all vying to have dApps come and build on them. We've already seen people start to leave one for another. So it's a highly competitive space. Ethereum forks, and I think we're going to face another big fork challenge, just as we saw from the Ethereum Classic guys when we make this switch to proof of stake. Then we have our centralized cloud options. And a lot of people saying, well, why can't you just use a centralized database or cloud services? Why do you have to use blockchain? And that is a valid argument in a lot of cases. We've then got our private blockchains and then protocols that are hoping to really gain dApps in the future. And I've recently covered Cardano. Cosmos has successfully launched, getting a lot of attention. People are talking about hash graph. So there's a lot of competition in the future, as well as Bitcoin implementing second layer solutions and possibly smart contracts as well. Next thing to touch on here is this fat protocol thesis. And this is really the problem with the Facebooks and YouTubes, Googles of the world, is that all the value in this internet stack has come from the application layer rather than the protocol. Now with blockchains, we want to put all that value back into the protocol itself. And we don't want all the apps taking all our value and all our data. And this is really turning things on its head. It's the thesis behind this whole decentralized movement, building a virtual machine. So a couple of valid critiques here. If you want to have a read of this in more detail, please press pause. But the basis of this argument is that Ethereum needs to have a lot of value. It can't just be used just for the validating transactions, particularly if we're trying to get this scaled and extremely cheap. Ethereum also needs to have some sort of store of value aspect to it, multiple utility. And we saw that in the ICO space. Once it had a second function, it had a dramatic increase in price. Now, I think STOs are going to be another lease of life for Ethereum, but I'll talk about that in a second as well. Look, we know Bitcoin is the ultimate speculative store of value at the moment, but we'd certainly want Ethereum once we have that new supply rate dropping to 0.2%. I think Ethereum is also going to be viewed as a store of value to some extent. Now, when we look at proof of stake security, this is still really experimental. And as I touched on before, we have some smaller projects that have successfully implemented proof of stake, but Ethereum is looking to add other functionality as well. So there's definitely the benefits of proof of versus proof of work, such as energy efficiency. You guys know that I think proof of work is really important for Bitcoin, but I think for a lot of other coins, they are going to have a more energy efficient algorithms. And then obviously we've got the concerns such as how this technology is unproven, it is experimental, and we're about to put billions of dollars of value into this new proof of stake consensus. When we have a look at how much money the Ethereum Foundation's got, well, they initially raised around $18 million, I believe, in the ICO, but they've given out some grants. So they're currently sitting on $90 million of ETH at current prices. Now, if Ethereum goes back to, say, $1,000, all of a sudden that bucket of money grows to, $900 million, and I think they're going to be giving out a lot more grants, particularly to projects that are trying to scale Ethereum and move the project forward. So there's still plenty of money in there for the time being. When we look at that token sale, it was $18 million worth of Bitcoin they raised back in the day, and ETH was in the hands of a few. We see the Genesis ETH, 69% there. So one of the arguments is that the Bitcoin whales, that Ethereum early adopters, it's very centralized. But as this ecosystem grows, people are using it, the token velocity increases, that distributes the ether in circulation. Now, our current financial system and our current internet, what we find is we have this pyramid-like structure where all the power concentrates at the top. is extracted from you and I. So I think as Ethereum is used over time, it's the opposite. It gets more evenly distributed. Let me know what you guys think. Do you agree with that statement? Finally, here we've got the Ethereum 2.0 clients under development. So we want developers to be able to come and join the ecosystem from all different backgrounds and code in different languages, because Solidity, it was new. There wasn't a lot of people that were familiar with it. Now we have estimates that anywhere from 250,000 devs that are now getting familiar with how to use Solidity. But obviously, the more clients we have, Ethereum is a set of rules. We can implement that set of rules in different languages with different frameworks, and we see the developers that are working on doing that. That's going to be a huge step forward for Ethereum development once we have that. Finally, the DApps overview. Look, Ethereum is definitely the leader. At one stage, we had 90% of all dApps coming out were built on Ethereum or ERC20 tokens for new projects. Now, we do read some stats that, Tron and EOS have got far more daily active users. I guess the counter argument there is that they're free, there's no fees, and we can't really judge what percentage of that is bots or real people, or because it's free, people are playing around more than they would on ETH where you have to pay gas. Look, all those are sort of valid arguments. I think you'd have to acknowledge that Ethereum has got the most dApps built on top of it, and the STO space, all the Ethereum standards that are being built out for non-fungible tokens, for KYC, for all these different STO standards, that's all happening on Ethereum, and that's what makes me particularly bullish on ETH going forward. Finally, that decentralization. ETH does have over 8,000 nodes around the globe. I don't think you can even compare it to some of these other proof of stake projects that have 7, 21, 100 nodes. Ethereum remains more decentralized, and we're hoping we can keep it that way after we implement sharding, proof of stake, and all these different scaling mechanisms. So there's been some fantastic talks lately by Vitalik, particularly this one at Token 2049, about the layer 2, about everything that he wants to bring to ETH 2.0. ZK Snarks is one that doesn't often get talked about, that provides not only privacy but tremendous scalability. We're already experimenting with that. But let me know what you guys think about Ethereum. Is it going to scale successfully? What are you most excited about? ZK Snarks and privacy? Plasma blockchains within blockchains, sharding that network into smaller pieces to dramatically increase the computational capacity and efficiency. Casper, proof of stake. Are you going to be staking your Ethereum to earn rewards? Raiden, state channels, Fate channels we've seen for Funfair, all these second layer Lightning-like networks. Look, I think there's so much happening on the ETH ecosystem. They do have a big head start, a first mover advantage. There's some fantastic competition out there that has different use cases, but let me know your thoughts on Ethereum below. If you've liked this video, please smash that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, share these videos around, and thanks for tuning in, guys. Cheers.